Well, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Fiona Jenkins. I'm the convener of the Gender Institute here at ANU. And on behalf of the Gender Institute and the Vice-Chancellor, I'd like to welcome you to this International Women's Day celebration. And I want first to acknowledge that we meet on the traditional lands of the Ngunnawal people and pay respect to elders past and present. And on this occasion, I'd especially like us to offer respect to the many strong women of this community, elders who have led, inspired and educated in so many ways, maintaining culture and law across countless generations. I'd also like to acknowledge any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders who are joining us here today. This feels like a particularly momentous International Women's Day celebration, and for several reasons. I think first, today brings back for me many memories of this event last year, when we gathered for this event in the wake of hailstorms and fire and thought, yes, COVID was a threat, but probably the worst of 2020 was behind us, and how terribly wrong we were. We've, of course, been very lucky as compared to many places around the world. We've minimised in very effective ways the direct impact of the virus, but of course the indirect effects are many, and plenty of them have affected people in our own community here at ANU and perhaps some of you here today. So there'll be plenty for us to reflect on during this International Women's Day celebration about the gendered impacts of COVID and what they tell us about ongoing discrimination and persisting inequalities for women. Second, though, and as events at the moment seem to come in great waves, we can't ignore what many are speaking of as Australia's Me Too time of reckoning, especially here in Canberra. And I'm wearing my feminist purple jiu-jitsu outfit for a reason, because I think women are angry, they're speaking up, some battle lines are being drawn. This is a very powerful, very important moment for International Women's Day to fall. Given what's afoot on Parliament Hill, many women I've met over the last few days are sharing many stories of past abuses to themselves and to others, often speaking of friends, of promising young women who something happened to and they disappeared, and people are wondering what happened to them and where they are now and how they dealt with those terrible events of so many years ago, often so many years ago. Now, of course, these issues have, of course, also affected boys, men, and non-binary genders, but they've fallen in a particular way on women, and that is an ongoing and urgent question that we need to think about here on International Women's Day. We also all need to look out for each other as we continue to try to work such stories, such terrible stories, into commitments here at ANU. We have made progress, but we still have very significant work to do to create a safer university and a fairer workplace for everybody. On Wednesday this week, I was incredibly lucky to be at the press club to hear the Australian of the Year, Grace Tame, speak, and she was just extraordinary. I have never felt that room with so much electricity, so much power in her words. And her clarity, I think, comes from the work that she has done to overcome the shame that sexual survivors feel. She has an extraordinarily powerful vision for justice and prevention of sexual abuse that I think speaks to everybody. And inevitably, of course, her words spoke to many issues of current concern. When she was asked how to help in situations where abuse has occurred or may occur, her advice was very simple, and I'm going to repeat it because I think it's something we may all need right now. Try to create space where people who are at risk or undergoing abuse feel safe to talk to you. Say, I hear you, and I will try to help you however I can. And respect that the lived experience belongs to someone. It's not just a story. The story is hers, it's hers to tell, and that needs to be respected. I think it's also an important moment for us to remember that there's considerable professional support available. And if things are coming up for you that seem difficult to deal with, or if people are disclosing issues to you that need advice and help, there are many support services here at ANU. And in fact, we have Michelle Linmore, who's a psychologist from ANU Counselling, here with us today. If anything comes up for you today, you're very welcome to go and see Michelle. An ANU Wellbeing and Support line is available 24/7 if and when you need it. Of course, the other really important message of this International Women's Day is that strength and the optimism of young activists like Grace Tame are inspiring everyone to try and do better. International Women's Day is about celebrating women without shying away from the many difficult challenges that continue to confront us all. So we need courage, we need hope, we need action. And with these words, I return to our panel today in the hope that your wisdom is going to lead and inspire us in thinking further. The panel is going to discuss sex discrimination and the Sex Discrimination Act, which outlawed sex discrimination over 40 years ago. The questions that the panel will address are, have we made real progress towards equality in this time? Or have we merely knocked the harshest edges of the patriarchy? Were feminists right to engage with the mainstream policy and law to achieve transformational change? Or did this limit the radical intent of the feminism of 40 years ago? So our moderator, Sally Moyle, is an honorary associate professor at the ANU and closely associated with the work of the Gender Institute. Sally was, until 2019, the Chief Executive Officer at CARE Australia, and between 2013 and 2016, the Principal Gender Specialist and Assistant Secretary with DFAT. Our speakers represent 3 generations of feminist legal thought. Our Emerita Professor Margaret Thornton from the ANU College of Law is a socio-legal scholar and feminist who's published extensively in the area of discrimination and the law. And Margaret also has a particular interest in gender in the legal profession and the impact of the corporatisation of universities on the legal academy. Dr. Karen O'Connell, who's joining us by Skype from UTS Sydney, is an expert in discrimination law, particularly sex and disability discrimination, sexual harassment, and biotechnologies of the body. She previously worked in the Human Rights Law and Policy Centre at the Australian Human Rights Commission, and in a number of senior roles, she produced national guidelines on sexual harassment and pregnancy discrimination. Radhika Chaudhuri is a university medalist and PhD candidate here at ANU in the College of Law, and her research relates to economic forms of domestic violence. Radhika sits on the ACT Ministerial Advisory Council for Women, where she advises on legal responses to domestic violence. And she's also worked as an associate to the Chief Justice of the Federal Court of Australia. So please join me in welcoming our panel.
Hi, everybody. Can you hear me? Yes, I think that's on now. It's lovely to have you all here. Thank you very much for coming, and welcome to Karen as well. I, like Fiona, would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we're meeting and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. And to particularly thank our fabulous panel. I've been so excited about moderating this conversation because we have such great thinkers here across 3 generations of legal thought. I have known, of course, Margaret for many years as the author of The Liberal Promise, which in our previous conversation we all noted is still as relevant today as it was when it was written 30 years ago. Karen, I've known for over 20 years when we worked together at the Human Rights Commission and were both responsible for overseeing the Sex Discrimination Act. And Radhika, of course, is an emerging thinker who I've been really excited to meet and to have the really thoughtful and new thinking about the way we take this generation, the gender equality agenda forward. So it's really exciting to be here. And for me in particular, I've spent 30 years in working inside government, working inside the system to try and change it. And the gamble that I explicitly took with myself was to say we can change this system. It is a cultural system. It's not natural to humanity. It's a cultural system of patriarchy that we can change, and by working within it, we can change it. And now I've just finished my full-time career and I'm reflecting on that, and so it's wonderful to have the opportunity to kind of get into that and unpack that a little bit with the panel today and with all of you as well. So the plan for us is that we'll have a conversation here on the stage and with Karen. I would like to have it as a flowing conversation, but I'm told because of COVID restrictions, we need to have people who have questions come down to the microphone at the front of the stage. So it makes it difficult for it to be particularly organic, but I will certainly make sure that there's time for us to have questions at the end. But for the moment, I thought that I would kick off the panel by saying, you know, we talk a lot about the aim for the gender equality agenda. We're looking for gender equality, but we don't really necessarily spend as much time defining the system that we're seeking to change. We don't talk about, you know, the patriarchy much. I reflected with Karen the other day that we used to sort of titter behind our hands at the notion of discussing the patriarchy, but we do need to name and identify the ingredients of the system that we're seeking to change. And so I wonder if the patriarchy is a term that is useful now or has ever been. And I'm wondering if I could ask Karen, first of all, to start us off with that conversation.
Thanks, Sally, and it's an absolute pleasure to join all of you here today. I still don't use the term patriarchy to describe my own work or the work that I do. Having said that, I agree that we do live in one. So why do I not use it when I think we live in a patriarchy? I think it is because I now see law in particular, the system that I mostly am engaged with to try and bring about gender equality, as more of an ecosystem of which patriarchy is one of the elements. I think for me, trying to come up with an image or a metaphor that's big enough that keeps you working, keeps you inspired to change how things are, while capturing all of the elements is what's tricky about the language that we use. For me, the idea of law as an ecosystem captures the idea that we don't just have one system of power. So even if what we're trying to do is get at gender inequality, the other sorts of social, political, cultural inequalities we have of race and disability, etc., play into those. And so we've got some really complex elements in there. And I use that sort of metaphor for myself, where I think of patriarchy as part of a big picture with many complex elements.
Thank you. And when I think that what we're talking about is a system where of dominance, really, where power is expressed as being over other people, and that applies to sex, and it applies to all of the other characteristics that traditionally haven't had the same voice. Margaret and Radhika, do you have some thoughts on that?
Is that okay?
I think that's working.
Yeah, okay. So, yes, I think there is a problem about using that word patriarchy. So,
it does seem to be on. Give it a tap on the top. Yep, that's working.
Oh, okay. Sorry. Yes, so that the term patriarchy does tend to be somewhat one-dimensional, and I've used it in my work if I'm talking about antiquity, ancient Greece, you know, literally the law of the father, whereas I think things are more complicated, multi-dimensional today, so that it's not such a useful term. But I agree with Sally that we don't really have the precise term, one term, that can actually apply. We talk about inequality, I suppose, in a rather vague sense, as encompassing all the things that we feel that are wrong and need to be addressed. But there's no one term. So patriarchy, I mean, is probably quite useful, and maybe the suggestion that it be brought back in would be helpful. But I think probably many men would actually object to that, because it does suggest that it's all-encompassing when it's actually not.
Yeah, I agree with the observations that Karen and Margaret have made. I think one of the very important reflections that sheds light on the system that and society that we live in is that it's probably too simplistic to just talk about patriarchy as being the only power structure. It's a very important one, and it invokes, I guess, the aspects of power that emphasise gender as the core of that power. But I think that it is more accurate to speak about an ecosystem of dominance. So I think it is a useful term when we are specifically trying to invoke the gendered aspects of those power structures, but it needs to be deployed with care and with understanding that it's located within a variety of different power structures, and intersectionality is a very real part of describing the reality that we're trying to change. So I do use the word patriarchy when I am trying to isolate one specific type of power structure that we see operating in society, but I do otherwise more generally adopt it with more caution because of these points that Margaret and Karen have made so well.
Do you know, I think one of the things for me is that just describing inequality as the system that we're seeking to change it sometimes lets people off the hook, because it enables us to think about, inequality from a liberal feminist point of view that's just a technical fix. We'll pass a few laws and everything will be fine. And, our experience over 30 or 40 years here around this table demonstrates that it's not the case. It's not a technical fix. And so we do need to have a deeper understanding of the way that these power structures are embedded in our society to give us an understanding of the level of challenge that we're facing, I think. And so I do think we've got to be careful about defining that. And it's great to be speaking here at a university where there's lots of emerging thinkers, and if we can find a way and find the language to describe the structures that within which we live, I think it would be a helpful contribution to make for our thinking about the future and where we need to go. It does need to comprehend those intersections and the interlocking nature of it, and how deeply embedded it is in our culture.
Raewyn Connell coined the term hegemonic masculinity, which I found that's quite helpful, because it's not suggesting that it's all masculinity, it's a particular type of masculinity. And I think that's quite useful also to think about in terms of the way authority operates, and power, of course.
Yes. So, I think the way we've framed up this conversation so far suggests that we agree that we're talking about a system of power and where inequality is quite deeply embedded. And I think that's the assumption that I make. And, my bruised body from years of doing battle on gender equality within government suggests to me that it is a deeply embedded system. And I'm wondering if I can ask the panellists how deeply do you feel that inequality is embedded in our system after, each of us spending many years working on this topic? How deeply are we, and how far do we think we're coming? I might start again with you, Karen, given that you're behind us.
Yeah, thanks, Sal. I think it is very deeply embedded, but it is also the reason why I think thinking of law or politics or the tools that we try to use to get at inequality as being embedded in a bigger system is useful, because as we apply those tools, the system is also changing. So it's not that we just have, a static tool and a static problem and we can apply one to the other. We're part of a whole dynamic system. So, to give an example from my own area, or one of my areas of work, which is sexual harassment, if you look at the statistics on sexual harassment, not only has nothing gotten better, it actually has gotten worse. The statistics on sexual harassment show that the problem is completely ubiquitous, seems to be entrenched. All of the things we've done to put the laws, the policies we've put in place don't seem therefore to have worked. And yet we know there have been huge shifts in how we think about sexual harassment, in naming it, in having people speak up. So I'm not prepared to say that we haven't succeeded on that, but what has happened is as we have addressed it, other things have changed. Our economic system has changed to be arguably harsher. We've got social media, which is a whole new framework. So I think that it's a very difficult thing to say we have just got this problem of inequality that we can measure in this way and we'll be able to chip away at it and it will get smaller and smaller. It's not how it works, and I think it's a reason to both be a bit overwhelmed at times by the challenge, but also why it's possible to stay optimistic, because we are constantly making things better, I think, even if that's not always showing in our systems of measurement.
Well, I think inequality is deeply embedded within our social psyche. So it's something that just can't be changed by law. And the other thing about the nature of law is that it tends to operate largely only in the public domain, not the private domain. So, John Stuart Mill said, law is of use only in that public sense. And so that we have this enormous difficulty. So anything to do with sex or sexuality is deemed to be somehow private. And so that it's always much more difficult to actually deal with in terms of public law. And so that's an ongoing problem. So that while we have made advances in the public domain since the Sex Discrimination Act was passed, in terms of the participation of women in the workplace and the distribution of women in positions of power within the legal profession, within Parliament, and so on, we still have that problem about what's occurring in private life, what's occurring in the family, who's doing the childcare, who's doing the housework. I mean, there seem to be private issues that are somehow beyond the domain of law. So that continues to be, I think, a major problem.
Well, except, of course, when it comes to regulating women's fertility. I mean, that seems to be the one exception for for that liberal approach, that women's fertility and rights to abortion have always been so highly contested and so highly regulated, and increasingly so. But sorry, Radhika.
Sorry, I was just going to say, I really wanted to pick up on what Margaret has just said about the way that law works has, I guess, in classical notions of what law is, it's public regulation of society and the exercise of public power. And when we think about what law does, we are often, and particularly in sex discrimination, we're thinking about the way that public law is used to regulate that conduct. So where the state is able to impose regulations on citizens and what they do. My research actually does look at private law, or the ways in which the law will regulate disputes between people, rather than the way that the state chooses to regulate its citizens. And that's, I think, a really interesting site for feminist legal thought and law reform work, because when we think about feminist law reform, very rightly and very justifiably so, the emphasis of a lot of that work is in public law and getting things like the Sex Discrimination Act and working on criminalising forms of domestic violence and that sort of thing. And there is really valuable work to be done there. And it is an obvious candidate for law reform because it's state-driven. And I think one of the interesting things that is sometimes left out of this conversation about sex discrimination is what that looks like in private law, where in civil cases, not criminal cases, how do we think about those principles about how to govern disputes between people in that private sphere. And those areas are less amenable to law reform because they can't be fixed in the same, fixed, I say with large air quotes, in the same way as public law areas are ripe for that kind of reform. So yeah, I guess I just wanted to introduce that also into this conversation, that when we think about law, we can be thinking about public law, but we should also be thinking about private law. And then, of course, the point that Margaret was making, there are a whole lot of activities that just are not subject to legal regulation at all, that are part of the way that social norms form gender relation norms. Yeah.
And, you know, I think looking back over 40 years of legislation around people's public engagement that the Sex Discrimination Act represents, it regulates public life, right? And it has set norms that have bounced onto the way people live their private lives. So it has seen, concurrent with the legislation, we've seen a massive engagement of women with the workforce. And I think the Sex Discrimination Act has a lot of credit to take for supporting women and opening those doors for women, and setting the norm that it is an expectation and a right of women to participate equally in the world of work, in the public world. And I think that's super important. So I think, but it is that iceberg, isn't it? You know, the private life is that iceberg, the 90% of that's under the waterline that is still influencing the way women and men engage in the public world with leadership and with the world of work, and that is preventing us from seeing further progress. And so we know that women are still doing the vast majority of unpaid work in the home, and that this really does interfere with women's ability to participate in the economy. And we're looking forward to seeing the fourth time use survey that should be out in the field, I think, nowish, and we're looking at the results of that next year. So it will really show us whether over the last 10 years since we've had a time use survey, we've seen any real change in the way that women and men share the unpaid burden of work. And I think that's super important. I really like the way that you frame up the notion of the public law in terms of the state's role in regulating behaviour and the role of individuals in the way they work together and using equity. I think is a really interesting idea. Radhika, do you want to tell us a little bit more about that?
Well, so the research that I'm doing is into domestic violence, particularly financial forms of domestic violence. And this often manifests in coerced transactions, those sorts of transactions, so the concept of emotionally transmitted debt, will often leave usually a woman with financial liabilities that are enforceable against her unless a court thinks it is appropriate to intervene. And the principles that govern that intervention is what I'm studying at the moment. But what the bigger point to make is that women's ability to access that kind of remedy is very much determined by the attitudes that courts bring to those kinds of cases, and the way that they choose to exercise their discretion, which I think brings us to the similar kinds of barriers that we observe in public law, where we do have a framework for addressing some of these issues. We have legislation, and in the case of equity, we have doctrines that are equipped to respond to these significant issues that women face, but there are non-legal structures that are interacting with law, whether it's public law or private law, that really undermine the work that is theoretically possible through law.
It's super interesting. And just to take up the point that Karen made originally, that we've seen 40 years of legislation outlawing sexual harassment, for example, and discrimination, but we've now up to our fourth national survey of the prevalence of sexual harassment in Australian workplaces, and the first one of which Karen and I started. We are seeing that there's very little change. Now, of course, that might mean that there's people more educated about what sexual harassment means and more willing to report it. But that survey always did give people prompts, you know, didn't it? It always helped people to understand what we were talking about and ask them if they'd ever experienced that kind of behaviour. So it didn't ask them to know the legal definition of sexual harassment, for example. So, and we haven't seen much change. And also, we see now increasingly countries around the world doing prevalence surveys of the incidence of domestic violence and gendered violence. And, you know, some countries have been focusing on this for decades and others are brand new to it. And we're seeing similar levels of violence against women across most societies. I mean, there are differences that may reflect some cultural values. So the incidence is quite reported as being quite low in Japan, but quite very high in the highlands of Papua New Guinea. And I think, but generally speaking, about 1 in 3 women is going to experience gender-based violence during the course of her life. And I think it's amazing how sticky this is. And so I just wanted to kind of, this is one of my frustrations, that we don't see substantive progress. And I'm wondering if Karen, do you have any further reflections on that?
Yes, I'm dying to reflect on that, Sally. I think in some ways, and I think you would probably agree, it's also not surprising at all. Because if we look at the remedies we've set up, and if we look at the Sex Discrimination Act as an example, we've got this ubiquitous problem of sex discrimination, but also, let's say, specifically of sexual harassment. And then we set up individual remedies to respond. So in the face of a really overwhelmingly large problem, we rely on specific individuals to raise individual incidents of that particular behaviour. And then it falls to that individual to effectively take on a whole system. We've seen that again over the last couple of weeks through the events in Canberra, that even where there appear to be very systemic problems, it often comes down to one individual, and there are all kinds of hurdles for that individual to speak up in the midst of this much bigger system. So I think as long as our remedies aren't systemic or broad enough, and we rely on individuals sometimes, risking more than any one individual should have to risk, we are going to see the continuation of a systemic problem. And this goes to Margaret's brilliant book, as you said, Sally, called The Liberal Promise. The reason it's called The Liberal Promise, Margaret, if you forgive me speaking for you here, but it's because our system of law seems to offer, it promises equality, through these laws that look like they bestow equality on us because sexual harassment is unlawful. It then looks as if we have some kind of protection against it. So I think we really, and we don't, in fact, have a systemic approach to dealing with it. So I think that as long as we rely on individuals to address such big problems, we're going to not only see the continuation of the problem, but that the tools that we're trying to use can be accused of being merely symbolic, and in fact entrench the problem because they only address it in the smallest possible way.
Margaret.
Thank you, Karen, for pointing those weaknesses that I identified in the Liberal Promise. I agree, absolutely. And it actually then, I think, highlights another weakness within our legal system. It's not only that it operates primarily in the public sphere, but it's the individualized nature of law in terms of, criminal law and civil law as well. So the focus is on the individual. And so we're actually highly resistant to recognising systemic problems and taking action in that way. So soon after the Sex Discrimination Act came into operation, we had, Susan Ryan was responsible for affirmative action legislation. And so this was the idea of actually overcoming this notion of the individual complainant having to bear the burden of taking on a huge corporation or whatever it might be, and actually reversing the onus, in a sense, in actually having the employer, the corporation, then take some sort of proactive measure to try and sort of foreclose the possibility of individual complaints. Well, there was huge opposition to that for years and years, and so we're now on the third iteration of the legislation, and each time it became weaker and weaker. It wasn't very strong to start with, but weaker. So we're totally opposed to actually recognising within our legal system that problems may be systemic. So there is still, we come back always, as Karen said, whether it's sexual harassment or whatever, to the focus being entirely on one individual. And, in an employment situation, that person may have lost their job, or they may not have a union behind them, or whatever. And so they just give up, which is another reason why the numbers we have are actually quite small.
Can I just add another layer of negativity to that? So I think I completely agree that with the observations about the problems in having such an individualistic focus, not having a system that's well equipped to respond to or even acknowledge systemic barriers, and the sort of the way that access to justice works to encourage people to give up before they get to court. The level of negativity that I would like to additionally offer is that when someone does get to court, so sex discrimination, the Sex Discrimination Act is not my core area of research, but my core area of research in private law is even when you have a plaintiff who is prepared to get to court, you then have to work through a lot of the preconceived ideas about what violence looks like, about what domestic violence is, about how gender roles work, and there is an uphill battle once you have your day in court as well. And so there are multiple levels at which the system is not really one that encourages the successful prosecution of these kinds of claims, whether they're under the Sex Discrimination Act or in equitable disputes about contracts. And we see that in lots of different jurisdictions.
Yeah, thank you. Look, I think it really does raise, doesn't it, the whole masculinised notion of individuals coming together in litigation, standing as equals, or in criminal law, the alternative notion of witnesses being merely witnesses, they're a tool of the criminal justice process, without having real standing in their own right. And I think some of these issues have shown to us, that particularly recently, that perhaps we need to have another really good look at the whole way that we approach our criminal justice and our public law as well, in terms of framing up litigation to make change happen. Because I think, you could very well argue right at this time in Australia's history that the criminal justice system is not fit for purpose for gender-based violence, for sexual violence, and it needs to have another look at it. But thinking about the Sex Discrimination Act and how difficult it was to pass in 1984, at the time, up until I think the Mabo legislation came before Parliament, it was the longest debated piece of legislation in Australia's history, and we saw during the debates that, the Sex Discrimination Act was going to outlaw Santa Claus, it was the end of Christianity, that families were going to be, the end of families as we know it. The sky literally was going to fall in from the discussions around the Sex Discrimination Act. And of course, as you say, Margaret, it was a small piece, it was a small step forward. And I think we have coasted on the back of that, and it has made significant changes. But sometimes I think in terms of the process of making change happen, the first steps are easiest. And sometimes the system that you're trying to change hasn't been given adequate notice of the depth of the change that you're seeking, and so they don't notice and they let it get through. There was always the mythical story of Dame Carol Kiddu, who was for a very long time the only woman in the Papua New Guinean Parliament who passed rape in marriage legislation by sticking it in the back of another piece of legislation and assuming that it was going to slip by without most people noticing it, and sure enough, that's how it happened. And so I think sometimes it's easiest to get the first steps onto the board, but beyond that it gets harder and harder. And I think we are facing another challenge now, and we need to take that next step forward as a society. And it's the battle lines are all arrayed and everybody's prepared to stand against it. What do you think though, Karen?
I think that there are times where we do law reform. And I think we've had really good sort of feminist-driven law reform in Australia. And there are times where we do the social change. And because each is embedded in the other and influences the other, I think you can make laws much more effective by changing the social assumptions and, culture that they are embedded in. Catherine McKinnon, who, is a very well-known US feminist who worked on the initial sexual harassment laws when they were first named in America, said about the Me Too movement that whatever laws you have about sexual harassment and sexual violence aren't going to work if women aren't believed. There is nothing you really can do with a law if you don't fundamentally believe in the levels of violence that women experience. So now I feel like now is an opportunity for a bit of social change. I've seen some amazing changes just in the period of time I've worked in gender equality, which is most of my adult life, in things such as women's loss of shame around sexual violence. I mean, there used to be such shame put on women who'd experienced violence that it was a risk to speak up just, you know, because of the way you were shamed. And women internalized a lot of that. And I think it's amazing now to see, you know, a lot of young women just prepared to speak up and know that it's not a shameful thing. Those sort of social changes have a huge impact. I think that there are times where we just have a sort of break or rupture in the system of patriarchy, if you call it that, where we have an opportunity to just make everyone look at things a bit anew and think about how they want things to be. And I feel like we might be in another one of those right now. So I feel sort of both exhausted and optimistic.
I absolutely hear what you're saying, and I do think that sometimes you just need to sort of step back, reframe the conversation, use different language and sneak up on it again, you know, because I do treat it like this, the change that we're seeking to make as a kind of a creature that we're trying to overcome, and so I do see it in those ways. Radhika, what do you think?
Oh yeah, I completely agree with Karen, and what I like about her observation there is that understanding that there are kind of there's the legal work to be done, as it were, that the legal barriers, so things like getting law reform on the books, and that's really important, and it continues to be a really, really important site of work for feminists who sort of fundamentally believe that that is a fruitful avenue for the feminist movement. But then there are these non-legal barriers that need to be addressed before the law can really do what it, or hope to do what it, you know, it promises to do. And I think that the non-legal barriers, certainly the work that I'm doing at the moment is exposing those non-legal barriers, the sticking points in women not being believed, and the sticking points in terms of judges continuing to think about domestic violence as physical violence only, and all of these sorts of things. And I think that is a more complicated body of work ahead of us. Yeah.
The early steps are sometimes the most straightforward, and then you start getting into the more complex and nuanced pieces of issues that make it more difficult to kind of frame up so easily.
Present themselves.
What do you think, Margaret?
Well, social change never moves in a simple progressivist manner. So there's always going to be opposition, and that was apparent with the passage of the Sex Discrimination Act. Although most people supported it, and that was partly because of Bob Hawke was the Prime Minister, was strongly supportive. That was an enormous help. And sometimes those who opposed it were seen as a little bit sort of mad. And there was a group known as the women who want to be women, as opposed to the women who want to be rabbits or whatever, who orchestrated this enormous letter writing campaign. And there were 80,000 submissions put in against passage of the Sex Discrimination Act, which seems absolutely bizarre today. And so that it was seen to be, the opposition then was seen to be, sort of belong to these ultra-conservative sort of cranks, I suppose. But I think it's interesting over time that I don't think that many people appreciated just the impact of the Sex Discrimination Act. And it was really some years before there was a backlash against women, so that became stronger. And many of the gains were actually undone during the Howard years. And I think since that time, we've seen a much greater division between conservatives and those who are supportive of the legislation. And I think I've suggested that I think it would be difficult for the same piece of legislation to be passed today for that reason.
And certainly in the international sphere, the Beijing Platform for Action that was, you know, passed by universal decree in 1995 is constantly being whittled away now in the Commission on the Status of Women every year. We're seeing, you know, that moving away from. So that brings us really neatly to the last question that I wanted to pose to the panel, and that is this something that we can do? Can we change these systems of dominance? Can we change the patriarchy, or are we just kidding ourselves? Are we, you know, I sometimes worry that we're, you know, if we'd left the patriarchy with its red in tooth and claw, we would have seen it being forced to change more radically. But by chipping away at its edges, by making it less harsh, that in fact what we've done is made it more fit for purpose. And this is, you know, where I'm up to in my life stage, really just going, was it worth it? Can we do this? Is it a challenge that we can meet? And I'm hearing from the panel that there are ideas about how we take this forward, but do we think, stopping and reflecting on this, do we think that it can be done? You know, the backlash that we're seeing now, is it just backlash, or is this a reassertion of the, you know, rights of the patriarchy?
Well, I think it's part of the struggle. And I think one has to accept that it's ongoing. People sometimes say to me, "How can you keep going with this?" You know, and you've sort of fought a particular battle in the past, and then one has to, you know, it's sort of all papered over, and then you have to start de novo. So it is frustrating, but I think that's the nature of social change. I think it's never going to be simple, but on the other hand, it doesn't mean that we give up because of that. We keep going, and you know, it's 2 steps forward, 1 back, or maybe it's the opposite. I'm not sure.
Are you asking me, Sal?
Yeah, let's go with you, Karen.
Okay. It really depends which day you ask me on. So there's no doubt that it's a hard slog some days. And then there are other days where it feels like we are not only changing things, but we already have. And you see so many good stories as well. At the moment, I think there is a real sense that there is some collective anger out there. None of us come to law or politics or even our own social circle as blank slates. We all have our own experiences of inequality, and those operate the way they do in society, sometimes to silence us and make us feel like we can't speak up, and sometimes to empower us and drive us to change. So I think that however hard this battle is, one of the good things that comes out of being feminist and working in this area for a long time is that kind of collective feeling that you get, the company that you have along the way, and despite our reputation, the humour that we share, maybe behind closed doors. But, you know, that sort of collective spirit is something that I think does drive us to keep going. And I feel a lot of that at the moment. So I think that if you're asking me today, yes, I do think we can change things. And we're going to very soon. Watch this space.
Yeah, look, I'm a little bit like Karen. I think that this question of whether it's possible to use law to address the patriarchy is really a fundamental one of feminism. And I'm not someone who studies feminist legal theory. I use feminist legal theory in my research. So I guess it's one of those questions that, depending on what day it is, I fall on one side of that debate or the other. But I think that, you know, I really agree with what Margaret and Karen have said, that it is a non-linear struggle. And I think that there are ways in which we can think about progress that has been made that should give us hope that despite the challenges that we face in the present moment, those challenges are part of the work, and they're part of what needs to be overcome. And so in the research that I do, and I know a lot of my colleagues who work in this area also see both the challenge and the opportunity that law presents, and this feels like a moment where some of those conversations can take place and maybe take us somewhere new.
I told you we'd finish on a positive note. And with that, I think it might be time for us to turn to questions from the audience. We've got about half an hour, so if we have anybody with burning desires to have their say, please come down to the front here.
so thank you so much for that discussion. I have a question that someone wanted me to ask as an anonymous question, for obvious reasons. Often survivors are asked to sign confidentiality agreements when they finally leave a workplace. How do we hear these voices, as these are people who may have not had the strength to personally take on the organisation or system?
Karen, I think you have something to say about that, and I can make some comments as well if you like.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think there is. Was there something added there? No. Okay. There's an increased understanding now of the impact of silencing of people at all levels of the system, and non-disclosure agreements I think, have been in the last few years. There's been new attention on them. So how do we hear the voices that have already been silenced is a really tricky one, because I think there has been just this long history of forcing people into confidentiality that they have not requested themselves, and often in the name of protecting women victims of violence in many forms. But what you are starting to see now come through are some workplaces that are committing to not having non-disclosure agreements imposed. The recent Respect at Work inquiry by the Sex Discrimination Commissioner tried to get at that by asking organisations to set aside non-disclosure agreements for the period of time of the inquiry. They had mixed success with that. But I think at the very least, there is a new attention being focused on non-disclosure agreements as part of a layering of silence when people speak up that happen in the workplace. It happens when you go to confidential conciliation. It happens again when you settle out of court. You know, we've got just layer upon layer of silence. So I do think people are starting to understand that, but we're nowhere near solving it yet. So I don't think there is a solution yet.
We're edging there though, and like you say, the Champions of Change Coalition has recently put some guidance out to senior leaders of organisations in Australia to say, be very aware of this. It's not as definitive as we might like, but it's a really big step forward, I think, towards recognising that silencing process for women and making sure that we can start unpeeling that next onion. So I think that's a really important question. Thank you.
Hi. I wanted to address what I feel is a little bit the elephant in the room, which is the accusation of sexual assault from, I believe, 1988 against Christian Porter. I was curious to know what the panel's thoughts were on both the legal and social response to allegations of historical sexual assault. Thank you.
Well, it's very difficult, as we know, this particular case, because the victim is no longer alive, and so can't give evidence. And we know that the New South Wales Police has decided not to persevere in terms of the criminal dimension. But that doesn't preclude the fact that there can still be some sort of inquiry. And I think that perhaps the way the Prime Minister was addressing it most recently, and some other pundits suggested that they were bound by the criminal norms, that it had to be proven beyond all reasonable doubt, which is not the case. So it's still possible to have some sort of inquiry, which is more open. And terms can be decided about that, because I mean it is very peculiar to have the chief legal officer of the land having this a cloud over his head forever, as you know, to be the Attorney General actually who's responsible for inquiries and so on. So there's a sort of extraordinary anomaly that's emerged in this case. But I think in the public interest, because there's so much media interest in the matter, that there should be some sort of inquiry. But if the Prime Minister is not in favour of that, I think it's very difficult.
Karen, I can see you're You're waiting to say something?
Yes, I agree with Margaret. I think one of the problems in public debate is we have been a bit co-opted by the criminal law. You know, it's so much a part of popular culture that people think of criminal law as the law. But if something doesn't meet a criminal standard or can't be brought as a criminal proceeding, and we know, as you said, Sally, earlier, that the criminal law is a terrible tool for getting at, you know, sexual violence, partly because it is so defendant-focused,
He said, she
because
said.
someone may lose their... Yeah, there's this kind of way of talking about it. So I think that it's really, really important for people to understand that there's a whole sphere of law outside of the criminal law. You can bring a civil action for sexual assault. You know, there are other laws here, but alongside that, you know, what we tend to do in Australia is if there is a sexual assault or sexual violence case that doesn't meet the criminal standard, we then stop talking about it. We act as if that means it didn't happen. And I think it's really important that we continue to talk about it, even when the criminal avenue can't be followed. And in this case, I have been in the media all of this week saying that we absolutely need to keep talking about it, and we do need to still inquire into it.
Look, I absolutely agree, and it is infuriating to see the, you know, the disappointment of those who wish that we could have a legal inquiry through the criminal law into this, but of course the complainant has killed herself. So it's terribly sad, but there's nothing more we can do, you know, wash my hands of it. It is infuriating to see that. And as Margaret said, the notion that our chief law officer in the land has a shadow hanging over his head is something that absolutely needs to be inquired into, I think. And it needs to be an inquiry at the civil standard of proof on the balance of probabilities that says not did he commit that sexual violence, but is he a proper person to lead the law in Australia? And does he, you know, do his attitudes and his approach to gender, his commitment to gender equality stand in the way of his doing that job effectively? I think it's a really important, it is an important time in our lives in Australia. And I think we've got another question.
Sally, could I just, I just wanted to add, because the person who asked the question also asked about social aspects, and I've really noticed this anger when the Prime Minister, for example, said that he believed the Attorney General without saying he'd read the full dossier of information. I mean, I think there is also a sort of anger that comes from the social level of the response, you know, where we're trying to believe women more. And so this kind of immediate belief of the other perspective, things like that, I think are creating social anger outside of the legal framework.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you.
Thanks. I'm Helen Watchers, President of the ACT Human Rights Commission. I was just wondering what you thought of the civil process for Dyson Hayden's case, the inquiry there by the High Court. I mean, it's a length of time since he was in the role, but at least it happened. And the impact the media had of women coming forward and how powerful it was to hear those voices.
What do you think, Margaret? Do you have some thoughts on Dyson Hayden?
Well, I think the Dyson Hayden, I mean, case is actually a very good precedent for the present one. The fact that there was an inquiry, but it wasn't bound by the criminal law. It wasn't a criminal proceeding at all. But the Chief Justice of the High Court, Susan Kiefel, then sort of arranged for this inquiry to be undertaken, and I think that was very valuable because it allowed the victims to speak up and to be heard in a way that was satisfying to them. I mean, as we said, this is somewhat more complicated for a number of reasons, but still, it's a useful precedent that should be kept in mind, and it wasn't a criminal action.
Karen, do you have any thoughts on the Dyson Hayden case?
I also agree. There are reasons why it's not comparable that the Attorney General did draw attention to in his statement to the press. that it was a matter that was within the workplace, but it still did involve a justice of the High Court who was no longer at the High Court, so a former justice, and it did look at it from a sort of institutional perspective. And the decision that was made there was, to change policies, to apologise to the women. I think it had a hugely important symbolic impact that can't be underestimated. And I agree, we have no exact precedent for what's happened in the Christian Porter situation, but it's the closest we have. And I think it was very well done by the High Court. So when our Attorney General says that an inquiry would be undermining the rule of law, and that sort of hyperbole that he's used about we would no longer need an Attorney General, I think that with respect, that is legally completely incorrect. That it would be within both our legal and institutional framework, it would be completely appropriate.
And it sort of also raises the question about the culture of gender equality within the public service and within the parliament. I think those are two questions as well that we absolutely need to start engaging with. Again, we've lost the focus on gender equality within government, and I think that this is the whole culture of the organisation is something that could usefully be part of an inquiry as well. Look at our lineup. So, yes, sorry, the next question, please.
Hi, so I think in part what I want to ask has been answered partly, but I've just returned to Australia fairly recently, having been based in Europe and in North America. And I sort of feel like, particularly in the last couple of weeks, it feels like Australia's a decade or two behind. When I've done work in Canada for the government, we always have to demonstrate that we're doing a gender-based analysis, and in fact, GBA+. In order to get funds to do research for the government. It's a requirement to integrate those kind of perspectives, even if what you're looking at has nothing obviously to do with gender. When I was based in Europe, if the equivalent of the Attorney General in the Netherlands had been accused of rape, there is no question in my mind they would be stepping down immediately. And so the fact that these questions are kind of, we're debating whether or not there's something to be done about it, I feel like we're a bit in the past. Last year, I think it was last year, the Us Too report came out, which highlighted what a problem this is, particularly in the legal profession. And given that the legal profession represents people trying to do something about it in the legal system, there's a particular, it's incumbent on the legal profession and on someone in the AG's role to be representative of what is okay and what's not. So my question is, if this is Australia's Me Too movement, if that's only happening just now, what can we do to use this movement? And maybe that's what could we learn from other countries which are a decade or so ahead, but what can we be doing to use this moment to move us forward?
Thoughts? Radhika, do you have any contribution?
I think this is an area where my thoughts are actually still developing a little bit about how do we harness this. And I think that looking at what governments are doing overseas is not something that the current government, I might say with a little bit of caution, is likely to take up itself in any proactive way, but it may provide a useful template or a useful roadmap for the kinds of things that that advocates can be pressing for in the Australian context. And so, I think that this moment in Australia has really highlighted the fact that perhaps attitudes, particularly for people in positions of power, are behind where they should be, and that overseas may provide a useful roadmap for activists.
Although I'm not sure that that's necessarily the case everywhere. If we think of Donald Trump and the US, for example, he presented a completely different image, which might have encouraged some of our leaders to emulate him. He showed constantly disrespect for women. So I think we have to take that into account as well. It's not just, what Canada and Europe and so on have done. And so I think that what we're seeing is really, I suppose, a decline generally in standards, if one can use that old-fashioned term, and we know that with a number of incidents on the part of our parliamentarians, which has been less than acceptable. They haven't resigned as they might have in the past, but the idea that they just sort of, bunker in and hold on to their positions, as we're seeing already with the Attorney General, is most unfortunate.
Karen, have you got any quick thoughts on that one?
Yeah, I'll just quickly add that, I think the power of the Me Too movement was in its collective nature. People don't easily give up power, but we do have a chance now. There is going to be an independent review. I think that's supposed to be announced around about now, that people can make submissions to, and there will be recommendations out of that. That's on the sort of legal side again, but of course on the social side, we've got to, Me Too ran on people's stories, collective stories. So we have to speak up, as Grace Tame said, and if we do it collectively, we're safer.
And if recent polls are anything to go by, women of Australia are quite angry about this, so it's beginning to show. Next question.
Thanks. So my name is Roseanne Kennedy. I'm in Gender, Sexuality and Culture at ANU. And your response, Karen, leads to my question. And this is about the Sydney schoolgirls and the Teach Us Consent campaign that they're running. And so there are, a couple of thousand testimonies of pretty severe, in some cases of sexual assault and coerced sex, and really showing lack of clarity around understanding consent or how to actually act on consent, especially because a lot of these have happened in situations where at parties and, sometimes with drinking, etc. So I wanted to really ask, I guess I have two questions here. You've talked a little bit about the limits of law, where, sometimes the legal system isn't the best system for, dealing with these issues. Is this a situation where what can law learn from this kind of collective uprising effectively, or how can law, is there a place for law to intervene? And I'm thinking, are we going to see cases coming out of this in the future? Once people think, am I going to take this forward?
Well, one of the things I think is really interesting about that interaction between where social attitudes are and how cases are litigated in court is that judges have very varying degrees of, I guess for want of a better word, wokeness in terms of how keyed in they are to these nuanced understandings of things like consent. And so I think that at least part of the answer to that question is really a challenge to lawyers about how they frame their submissions before judges, rather than just relying on judges to, by osmosis, pick up on where the discourse is at and what they should be thinking about in terms of our cutting-edge ways of thinking about violence and gender roles and consent. I think there is a role for lawyers to play in terms of how they bring these cases to judges before them and say, well, this was an assault because this is what consent means, and that is not what happened in this case, and really challenging judges to have to engage directly with those questions rather than relying on their sort of background knowledge and taking that background knowledge into thinking about what consent might be, for example.
One of the issues I think for the law and the way our common law system works is that lawyers, it's difficult for lawyers to challenge judges because they are representing their clients and they don't want to put their clients into a position that would, their advocacy is less than useful. So I think that's one of the issues that we've got to face. But Karen or Margaret, what do you think?
Well, I agree that it's that the individual lawyer can run a case that's in the best interests of his or her client. And so that's where they can actually challenge orthodoxy. So I think it is quite important, although I know it's sometimes said, well, the lawyer can't sort of be practicing law reform on his or her client. But if that's what the client wants, and there is going to be, I think, probably quite a few cases will come out of this, because we know the evidence shows that as soon as there is media attention, that a lot more complaints follow. So I think we can expect some change in the law, and not all judges, but the most sensitive judges are going to be responsive to that.
Yes, I would just add to that I think consent law reform is a kind of case study in feminist success in law reform without it translating into change. I don't think the criminal law is going to help us very much here at all. And I think that for school-aged girls, we've really let them down, and that there does have to be a huge social response to this. I know there are things that are starting to be underway as a response, but I think I think young people now actually do have much more nuanced ideas about sexual roles and gender roles, but it is not translating into being safe sexually. And that is a huge gap that we have to address, and I don't think through law.
And I think, Marion.
Thank you, Sally. Can you hear me? Okay. I'd like to think that, you know, not everything we've been doing over the last 40 years has been a complete waste of time. And I don't think it has been, because the expectations of women have risen out of sight, so that's a good thing. I think our current Me Too moment is likely to lead to improved conditions of employment for political staffers, so that's a good thing. However, over the last 40 years, what's been happening is that public policy has been becoming more and more reliant on market solutions to every conceivable issue. Now, markets don't generate equality, and we've all been agreeing, I think, today that it's inequality which underlies the kind of issues we've been discussing: sexual assault, sexual harassment, other kinds of harassment, and so on. So we've got public policy which is generating increased inequalities. We've got a loss of confidence in the capacity of public provision, public regulation, confidence in the ability of the state to promote social justice. So where do we go from here, panel?
Thank you, Marion. If you hadn't have come down, I would have called you down. I think you're one of the key leaders in thinking about how we work from the inside. So thank you for that. And I think bringing the links to neoliberalism and the limits of neoliberalism is also a really interesting point to have raised. So, and particularly at the context that we're facing now as the globe responds to COVID, and we're seeing, you know, some of the more Keynesian approaches to responding emerge. So I think maybe we are seeing the end of that neoliberal kind of privatisation approach. What do we think?
I'm not sure about that. However, one of my main criticisms of discrimination law is that class is not a prescribed ground. So, you know, we've got sex, race, etc. And, you know, I think in Victoria we have 18 different attributes, but no jurisdiction in Australia addresses class, and nowhere else actually in any Anglo-speaking jurisdiction prescribes class discrimination. So I think this is an enormous problem that accompanies these issues and helps to explain, you know, Marion's concern there. So that we believe in inequality of wealth, in other words. So it's very hard when we have that, you know, that major manifestation of inequality to bring that into other areas when we deny that it exists, or we're simply happy to accept, you know, that some people receive millions of dollars and others, you know, receive a tiny amount from government in terms of New Start or whatever.
Yeah, I think it's actually brings us really nicely back to where we started this conversation about law being part of, I guess, an ecosystem of power structures, of which I think the private market and the extent to which that is a driver of inequality plays a really important role. And yeah, when we talk about inequality and being the ability to participate in public life and the terms on which we do that, class and the impact of the distribution of wealth under capitalist systems is a really important part of that conversation. And so when we talk about the patriarchy, really we're talking about the patriarchy plus all of this other stuff and all of these other types of power. So that wasn't really a solution at all. That was just me restating the problem.
And Karen, some last thoughts from you on, on Marion's question, but generally as well.
I'm going to go out on a limb and say I actually think Australians at heart are mild-mannered socialists. I think that when it comes down to it, we actually want the government to step in. We saw it coming out of the aged care report. 50% of Australians right off the bat said they'd pay more tax if it went to improving aged care. You know, no one wants to give up Medicare. You know, I do think that while we've been subjected to this overwhelmingly kind of pointy end of capitalism, to the theories of neoliberalism, we've been hugely influenced by America, and even in that context, I think we kind of have kept our hold on a little bit of socialism. So I don't think that has gone away, and I do think that in the current political environment where capitalism is under strain, we might see some interesting public policy changes there too.
Yes, and I think, I mean, for me, I think that we are seeing the growing in vertical inequality that's taking us back to the 19th century. The levels of inequality we're seeing between the richest and poorest is worse than it's been for well over a century now. And I do think that we're getting to the stage where it's getting so ridiculous that we will see a bit of a tipping point that we need to come to. But I've always said that in the face of the business case for gender equality in the world of paid work, I've always said that one of the few things that trumps capitalism is patriarchy, that private organisations would rather continue sex discrimination than address it, even though we know it's costing them money. So I do think both that capitalism and the patriarchy are both very sticky forms of systems of dominance that we're working within. But I mean, we need to wrap up now, and I think I just wanted to finally say thank you to our panel and to all of those who raised such interesting and intelligent questions. Thank you very much. And to say we've been through a process, I think, through this panel of taking ourselves into the depths of despair and then bringing ourselves back out again to points of hope and optimism. And I think that we do need to see that the opportunities that we're facing now are greater because we're facing a crisis, both an inequality crisis from neoliberalism's point of view and a crisis in relation to sexual violence in particular, in the way that the law can respond to gender equality, but also in the way that the government responds to the broader issues that women face. And so the failure of the last budget to integrate any kind of conceptions of gender equality was such a failing that I think that the government's on notice that this budget and then the pre-election budget, they need to do better. So I do think that it's time now for us to remain vigilant and to really carry on with this and press forward with the agenda of gender equality. And good luck to all of those of you here who are, and particularly to Radhika, who are going to be carrying the burden of it forward for the next 40 years. So good luck.
Thank you.
And thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Sally, and the entire panel for what was a great discussion. We have focused a lot about the challenges which have become in sharp focus over the last several months, but of course, sharp focus, but always there. I think when I reflect back to when I arrived in Australia in 1994, I was surprised, and I think one of our questions was that we were a decade behind. It was my reflection in 1995 that Australia felt like about 1958 in the United States. But progress has been made. I think the first female physics professor was promoted to professor in 2000. Now we have many. So progress is made, but as we see, sexual violence and harassment continue as women become empowered. And so we have these systemic problems that I think we all hope would have subsided, but they haven't. So we have made, I think, progress in empowering women, but then some of these really systematic issues that we've talked about today remain. For us, and for me, I guess thinking about an institution like ANU that has its own set of rules and norms, and we have what is effectively a legal system here, which is our academic conduct and all those things. And I do think having that systemic approach is a really important way for us to achieve what we want. And guidance from experts here at ANU, Gender Institute, of how to better embed that as a system, as opposed to it being individuals taking up problems, I think is something I'm reflecting on today, and I think it's a place for us to make progress at ANU. What I don't want is this to become just a tick-a-box exercise where we say, well, we've done what we're supposed to, let's move on, because that actually doesn't do things. It is a way of essentially symbolically acknowledging that there's a problem without actually making progress. And I think at this point, we're certainly at a point where we need to make progress and make it rapidly. I certainly also see the progress is very lumpy, and we're in a place of retrograde right now, the United States being an example of extreme retrograde compared to a lot of progress made a long time ago. So hopefully we will get going on the front foot again. So, when I look at the staff and the students we have here, we try to celebrate, as an institution, the diversity of gender, but of all cultural background, of socioeconomic background when we're talking about class. These are all things that we celebrate. We celebrate that diversity, yet entrenched is things that push against that, and we have to be aware of that. So the university continues to try to look at a system to try to equilibrate things, how we bring women onto our campus and then support them so that they thrive once they're here. And again, we're making progress, but I wouldn't say we've nailed it yet. For example, we had sponsored 49 new academics over the past several years to start research careers here, and half that money, more than half that money, was spent on women, and that was intentional to try to make sure we level the playing field. Because inequality is entrenched from birth in many, many cases, and this notion that things are done purely on merit, when actually there's this inequality making merit appear as something that it other is a real big problem, and academia has it in spades, and it's something we need to be very cognizant of. We're trying to also make things, I would say, giving a chance to even things up on the other side of the male side of the lecture, allowing men to take paternity leave and share that time and that opportunity. And there are challenges. Men and women have different roles in paternity, but trying to make it as equal as possible is one way that we can potentially make things better. So we have, I think, a very innovative scheme that we announced last year, trying to make sure that when people do take carers or paternity leave, again, preferentially women, that we're able to close the gap on superannuation so people are not disadvantaged then later on in life. These are all things that we have agreed to do over the past several years, and they are progress, but they are not complete solutions. So in the end, from my perspective, there is a lot of work to be done. I am fortunate to have, again, some of the best thinkers in the nation on this, and being able to practice what we preach and we think is a way that I think this university can make great strides in gender equality, but of course many of the things that we're doing. And it is the work of leading women and men, including those of our distinguished panel, who are essentially the champions for the change and provide the ideas and the impetus for us to make a difference as we move forward. I do note that a lot of these contributions as we described as the patriarchy, are not actually recognized as equal contributions, and that's another thing we need to think about, how we ensure that diversity of work and excellence is recognized by what is a very long-standing tradition. And that is something that I know Fiona will see in philosophy, but you will see in many, many disciplines. So I think that today is a time where we can reflect on some of the progress, but also the challenges. And for me, it's a chance to reflect on how we can make ANU a better place. ANU does create many of the people who go out and make changes. And one of our greatest pioneers for equality was the late Honorable Susan Ryan, referred to many times here today. Last September, we were deeply saddened by the loss of Susan. She was an ANU alumna and a great friend of ANU, and of course, a remarkable Australian who, when you look at it as the single woman in the Hawke cabinet, pushed through all of these things back in 1984, which I think you correctly say probably wouldn't even be able to happen in 2020. Susan was the first female senator in the ACT in 1975, the first female to hold a cabinet role in the Hawke government, Minister for Education and Youth Affairs, a minister for assisting the Prime Minister of the Status of Women. And she pioneered extensive anti-discrimination and equal opportunity legislation, including what we discussed today at length, the Sex Discrimination Act of 1984 and the Affirmative Action Act of 1986, which go hand in hand as we described today. She was our first age discrimination commissioner from 2011 to 2016. So in that same year, in 2016, Susan delivered the Order of Australia lecture here on campus and advocate the urgent need to change attitudes and practices to help eliminate age discrimination in the workforce and to better prepare Australia for the years to come as life expectancy continues to arise. And in 2017, we recognized Susan's legacy with an honorary doctorate. I was very proud to be part of that. And she became our Alumna of the Year 12 months later for her contribution in all of these areas. As a very active member in our alumni community, she helped launch our inaugural ANU Women's Alumni Network, co-delivered the inaugural Foundation Day address with her long-term colleague and friend, former ANU Chancellor Peter Boehm, who famously crossed the floor to support her. So today, to honor Susan's incredible legacy and to recognize her leading role in defining our national discourse, I'm very pleased to announce that our flagship event for International Women's Day will be recognized as the annual Susan Ryan Oration. The oration will commence next year on International Women's Day. It will be a high-profile point of national focus, continuing Susan's legacy and driving the important conversations which she helped to ignite. And we are joined today by Susan's partner, Rory Sutton, and it is truly a pleasure, Rory, to have you join us today. I am sorry I'm emotional for everything you've gone through, but I do thank you for all the support you and Susan have provided to ANU, and it is certainly my privilege to honor you and her legacy. She was such an incredible advocate, and she will always be remembered for those contributions that have changed our world and Australia for the better. And I do think this is a lasting legacy which will allow that to endure. Please join me in thanking our panel again, and let's continue to reflect and celebrate on the achievements of women all over the world as we make a difference together to bring equality to the fore. So please, thank you. I'd like to invite our panelists and our audience here to join us outside in the foyer for afternoon tea and have a chance to discuss further what we have. I encourage you to have a chance to talk to Rory and to our panelists. For my part, thank you all for coming on this very important occasion. I am sorry for my emotion, but I just can't help it sometimes. Thank you.